Hello everyone and welcome. I hope you can hear me. My name's Giles Whittell. I'm an editor at Tortoise and this is our regular Friday lunchtime Sensemaker Live Think-In, at which we are going to ask whether the recent £1.6 billion bailout for the arts is truly world leading, as ministers in the government have called it. Whether there's enough of it, whether it's come in time, who's going to get what, as far as we know. And we'll get to all that, the views of some very well-informed, much better informed than me, guests on that, and your own views too. But first, by way of introduction, many of you I know the drill at Think-Ins. But just briefly, for those of you who don't, I should first say thank you to Santander, who sponsor our Sensemaker Live Think-Ins and our journalism generally, and we're very grateful to them. And I should secondly say that this is really very much like a normal Think-In, not least in that we are going to focus on one subject, but it is the Sensemaker bit of it refers to the Sensemaker newsletter that we put out every morning, which contains what we think are pointers to some of the headlines that are important. So I've described this Sensemaker Live Think-In as previously as a large hadron collider of news, at which tortoise style slow and open news meets old-fashioned fast breaking news. So today I should probably call it the mosh pit instead, or the street theatre of news. In any case, it lasts an hour. It's recorded because it's a Zoom call, and we do hope to use the best bits in our future journalism. The main point of it, as with any Think-In, is that everybody who has something to say gets involved, and that we all emerge from it better informed than we are now. In my case, starting from a very low base, that won't be hard. But I hope that we can extract from all of you your wisdom on arts funding and arts generally in the UK in the time of this crisis. How to get involved? Well, there's the chat function at the bottom, which my colleague Barney is going to be monitoring. Hi, Barney. And we'll keep an eye on people who are saying interesting stuff there. And I will, if necessary, turn to Barney if I can't keep up with it and say, what have you spotted? And we may come to those who say interesting things and ask if they would like to verbalize them. And secondly, of course, as you know, if you click on participants and go down to the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you should find a raise hand button, and that is your blue digital hand, which will come up and we should see at the top of the list. I'm going to come to our guests first in a second, and sometimes I try to use the digital hand function as a sort of instant polling mechanism, but there's a limited value there because it's very hard to count in a hurry people who raise their hands. But I would like to ask, first of all, if anybody in the room, as it were, has already been, in a sense, rescued by this money that was announced just a few days ago by Oliver Dowden, the Culture Secretary, and was, by common consent, more than most people in the creative industries were expecting. Obviously, the devil's in the detail, but if there's anybody who feels already rescued by that, or conversely, who works in the creative industries, but is actually already out of a job because of the pandemic, I'd be really interested if you'd be brave enough to raise your hand right now. If not, that's fine. But it would give a sense of whether we have people from the front line in the room. I don't see any hands going up, except I do. Jenny, would you like briefly to tell us which of those two categories you fall into? Jenny McCulloch?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Yeah, the second category, unfortunately. I've just been given notice that I'm being made redundant.
And what from, if I may ask?
From publishing, trade publishing.
Right. And do you have any sense of how permanent that is? Or I mean, what sort of things were you told about possibilities for coming back to work?
Well, the bottom line is just who knows what will happen in the future. But the company has really benefited from the job retention scheme,
Right.
and I think that's the reason why the company will be able to continue in its sort of leaner form.
Right. Now, in trade publishing, do you know whether the company will be eligible for any of the creative industries funding?
Yeah, it's already well supported by the Arts Council of Northern Ireland, which is trying really hard to help the imprint survive, because its backlist has great cultural importance in Ireland.
Mm. Sorry, what is the backlist?
So it's in the past it's published poetry and fiction,
Right.
history, political history,
Right.
that's valuable and that needs to stay in print.
Right. Well, look, thank you for raising your hand and reminding us, frankly, that this is about real lives and pretty serious. And I hope very much that, well, if we don't get the V-shaped recovery that optimistic people talk about, we at least get one that gets you back into the kind of work that you enjoy as soon as possible.
Sure.
Annabelle Turpin, can I come to you? You are CEO of ARC in Stockton-on-Tees, which seems to do everything. And I confess, I'm not exactly sure what ARC stands for, but it's a multi-function cultural space in Stockton-on-Tees, and you are deep into so much else in the arts that I think the whole infrastructure would collapse. It's certainly in the Northeast if you were not there. In an email exchange with my colleague Ellie before this, you sort of reserved judgment on whether you think that the funding proposed by the government, offered by the government, well, it constitutes a world-leading bailout or not, because you said a lot depends on whether it ends up being used as a stimulus as well as a bailout. What's the difference? What did you mean by that?
So I think there are obviously lots and lots of building-based organisations and other companies that are closed at the moment and are at risk of going into liquidation. And of course they need supporting, and we want to see all these buildings reopen, but we know that they're not going to be able to do that for quite a while. So in terms of a bailout, giving them money to keep their workforce in employment whilst they're closed, to enable them to reopen, that's a way of bailing out organisations. In terms of a stimulus, I think this is organisations like ARC and other art centres can come into play. We're able to reopen sooner because we don't just do live performances. We have a much broader programme. So if we get some of the money, and that's obviously what we're lobbying for, then we're able to immediately start employing artists and freelancers who at the moment aren't going to get any of this money. That's been made very clear. So we're able to bring those artists and freelancers back into employment, and also for the work that they do to reach communities across the country who will obviously enjoy and benefit from lots of cultural experiences. That to me is a stimulus, because that is getting more people into employment than would otherwise happen, and as I say, also providing some social and other economic benefits. So that's the kind of balance, I think, and I'm not saying it should be one and not the other, but I think it would be a real shame if all the money went into just saving the kind of the status quo and maintaining closed buildings until they can reopen again. We want to see some activity come out of this for both social and economic benefits.
So the first use is what I've seen described elsewhere as sort of hibernation money. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of talk of hibernation and mothballing, and obviously some organisations have been forced into doing that.
I would like at some point to get onto predictions of what live performance is like 1 and 2 years hence, and whether we ever go back to the status quo ante. But first, can I just, I want to get clear on freelancers, because it's an absolutely key point, isn't it? And it was the biggest criticism voiced immediately after the money was announced. You're saying that they have said, that the government has said that this money is not for freelancers, but if it came through you, you're also saying you would hire freelancers. Is that okay with the Culture Secretary?
I haven't asked him, but in a sense, if we're given money to enable us to continue trading, I guess the point is that arts centres are able to reopen and do things other than live performances. So we'd still be using the money to protect organisations to ensure that towns like Stockton continue to have an arts facility in their area. But the added benefit, in a sense, is that we can get other people back into employment. 70% of the workforce in the kind of cultural industry is made up of freelancers, and we're really concerned that they're not being supported.
Okay, before we move on, let me just come back to the initial question, world leading or not. What was your initial response when you saw the headline numbers and you heard ministers talk it up? Broadly speaking.
I think there was always a risk that we weren't going to get anything for our sector. So there was definitely some relief and I think I was pleased, not least that the value of arts and culture was being recognised. So I don't know whether the money's enough. I don't think anyone is actually in a position to judge whether the money is enough or not, because we don't know how long it's got to last. They're saying it is just for this financial year. So it's just to get organisations to the end of March. Whether there's going to be more money after that or not, who knows? And in a sense, until we know when organisations are able to put live performances on again and start to rebuild their earned income, I don't think anyone can judge whether it's enough or not. So I don't think it's world leading. I think it would have to be a lot more and spent in a very imaginative way if we were going to claim it was world leading. Right. But it is positive that the value of arts and culture, both economically and hopefully socially, has been recognised.
Great, well, thanks. Let me move on, if I may, to Errol Francis, who is Artistic Director and CEO of Errol. Where are you? Hi. Culture and, I should say Culture and, right?
Culture and, yes.
Yeah, and also Director of the New Museum School.
Yes.
In London.
Yeah.
How do you hope this money affects you?
Well, I mean, I would hope. First of all, I broadly welcome the announcement. It's great, as Annabelle said, that the value of the arts is being recognised. I also share the view that compared to other schemes in other European countries, it's probably not well leading. But the thing that concerns me most about the announcement is the way that it immediately went to talking about crown jewels. And also, I think the definition of an arts activity, that it's, a venue that, is putting on live programs, shall we say. Now, the work we do is developmental. The New Museum School is aiming to open up who works in the arts and heritage sector. So we provide traineeships in collaboration with the museum and arts sector. And we have about 20 trainees a year who go through that. We also have an audience development program that we do in collaboration with, museums and arts organizations. And so in terms of, we've been indirectly impacted by this. So the bottom's fallen out of the curatorial work that we were doing collaboratively this summer over this year, and the placements somewhat in doubt in the coming period. We don't know when venues are going to be opened and in what form. So we are deeply affected by this, but we're not, we haven't got seats. We're not a museum, we're not a theatre. And it's just the description of this so far seems to me to be more about performance, live performing organisation, live arts, performing arts organisations, and probably when we talk about crown jewels, the big museums. So I'm just wondering about small organisations like ours who are not performance-led, we're developmental. Where do we fit into all of this?
And have you been given any indication of whether you're eligible?
I have no idea. I have no idea at the moment, actually, because, I mean, as has been said, I mean, the eligibility criteria and what's being offered in terms of whether it's a stimulus, whether it's loans, whether it's grants, Yeah, and the other thing is, we get our funding from the Arts Council and National Lottery, and so if DCMS is administering this from the top and setting the criteria, how is that going to be delivered at the Arts Council end? It's all up in the air. I have no idea at the moment.
But you've not yet had to cancel placements. Presumably you've had to cancel anything that was scheduled for this summer.
We haven't cancelled placements, but we've cancelled programs that we're going to do collaboratively with other organisations. They've been cancelled.
Right. Okay. Understood. Just coming back to the world leading line, we don't have to dwell on that unnecessarily, but I confess to finding it irritating because this government and its predecessors like to boast on very flimsy ground. They did it with driverless cars. They're doing it with vaccines. They've done it with one or two other things that I noted down before we started. And the headline figures for France and Germany appear to be much higher, although also reflective of perhaps a different role that governments regard culture as having in broader national life. Do you think it's helpful or unhelpful to try to be number one when the numbers simply don't support it?
I mean, it's classical political hype, isn't it? And it's not only just hype, but it brings the whiff of elitism in it automatically. You know, when you start talking about, yeah, sure, you know, we don't want the Royal Albert Hall to go under. You know, we want these, you know, these global brands, as it were. Nobody wants them to go under. But the definition of, if you're going to use world leading as your opening kind of description, that automatically is elitism. You know, I mean, small organisations like us, we can't use that sort of language. It just doesn't work for us.
And just while we're on museums broadly, you are our representative from the museum sector, I'm afraid. Okay. What's the future for visiting museums physically? The National Gallery reopened this week, but with very careful crowd control and social distancing. Is that the future, as far as you're aware, for all exhibition spaces?
I think so. I think that for the foreseeable future, I mean, it's actually a contradiction. I was a friend of mine who lives in Florence was telling me about what the Uffizi Gallery is doing, and if you can actually get in, it's going to be probably a more pleasant experience actually to be, you know, one of a few people looking at old masters and so on. But it is really challenging, I think, in terms of safety and how, you know, like the British Museum, Tate, how they can really operate with their audience, the normal level of audience that they attract. It's going to be challenging until either we get a vaccine or this whole pandemic is brought under control. It's very, very, it's going to affect exhibition design, layout of museums, staffing of museums, the cost of exhibitions and so on. So it's an unknown future, actually. Yeah.
That's really interesting. I never thought that the Uffizi would in any respect resemble my local Sainsbury's, but it does. Once you get through the queue, it's just rather wonderful inside.
Yeah.
Let me come, Barney, you must interrupt me. There's a lot happening in the chat, and I'm interested that Louise Simpson is accusing the government of, broadly speaking, having very little cultural appreciation, and there's we may come back to you, Louise, and ask you to say why you think that. But first I want to come to Breed Kirby. Breed, you are a comedy producer and manager and director of Fight in the Dog. It is Fight in the Dog, not Fight the Dog, yes?
Yes, that is the name of my production company.
Oh, right. Okay, great. Well, I was taking a quick look at your Twitter feed just before we started, and you said that the Culture Secretary said 19 hours ago, probably about 20 hours ago now, said the Culture Secretary ignores an entire cultural industry in comedy, I take it. and you're still pushing and screaming and shouting. Do I infer from that that you're not getting any of this money?
Well, that's the real concern. So I am a freelancer. I'm an individual. I'm one of these people who are the 70% that are sort of screaming and shouting about needing recognition. And I'm also one of the people who fell through the cracks of the original scheme, insofar as some of my contracts were PAYE. So by the system in which it's been set up, I'm one of the people that has not benefited from it. But I set up an organization called the Live Comedy Association with a couple of colleagues back in May, because we recognized that this entire cultural industry had no formal organization or trade association to represent it in these discussions. Now, since then, we've made huge inroads with DCMS. I've been sat on the Events and Ends Working Group, working towards the Cultural Renewal Task Force alongside various other cultural industries. So we're finally having a voice in these discussions, and it feels like we're getting somewhere. And then to see this announcement where we immediately go, oh my God, there's a bailout and it's far more money than everyone was expecting and talking about, and then the word comedy not to be recognized at all within it, is real cause for concern. And then as more information comes out and all these language around crown jewels and institutions, we're getting really, really concerned that we're being left out again. So we ran a public facing campaign yesterday on social media, #SaveLiveComedy, in which we were asking people just to post their most memorable live comedy experience to showcase the wealth of creativity within this industry. Our biggest concern, and again, this comes back to a lot of what was said earlier with regards to bailout versus stimulus, is we're a very grassroots industry. We're not talking about the kind of big household name individual comics needing help, because we know they don't, and no one is claiming that they do. But we're talking about access to the arts. The thing about live comedy is ticket prices are cheap. It exists all over the UK, and it brings in money into local economies, into pubs, into restaurants even, and into all of these art centres where they fill gaps in programming. And what we're going to lose is all of those voices and all of the bespoke comedy clubs in which people work up and hone that material. And what we've been shouting and screaming about is to say that the best TV comedy that you know starts in those clubs. And we're very quickly creating a very diverse industry with voices representing all corners of the UK. And if we lose that entire industry, the knock-on effect of that is going to be never ending. So it's kind of twofold. It's partly about just getting included in the language that's coming out of DCMS. Every time you mention musicians and actors, why are comics not being mentioned alongside that? It's deeply disrespectful. And then as a result of that, we're concerned that when the eligibility criteria is announced, that even as an oversight, even if it's unintentional, we're just not going to be included. So that's kind of the overall push that we're making. And yesterday we saw a huge swathe. I mean, there was something like the Twitter stat said 1.1 billion eyes were on these tweets across the world. So we're making inroads. But then at 5 p.m. to see that announcement come out, and we were going, oh, maybe this is going to be the one time he might mention it. Nothing. So we're just waiting now at this point, and we're still pushing. And the Shadow Ministry are extremely supportive. Tracy Braben in particular and Joe Stevens are constantly pushing, and they've been including comedy in all of their language. There's just a barrier of access into getting the Culture Secretary to really acknowledge that there's an entire industry being forgotten.
I would say it's a sense of humour failure, but it's worse than that. Right?
Yeah.
But just to be clear, are individual comics who are not or not yet household names being picked on any more clearly than individual actors or artists or performers of any, because they're all freelancers, right?
Yeah, no, they're not at all, except for the fact that the industry survey that we did, which was published on Thursday, I can put a link in the chat later. What we learned from that, which does feel slightly different, is that half of our freelancers have not had access to the government support. And we think the reason behind that is because the people who are on this circuit, who do those live gigs before becoming household names, tend to have day jobs alongside doing that, right. Which again, I know isn't specific to comedy, but I wonder if the proportion of comics that applies to is higher than potentially the proportion of actors that applies to. And so when we can say that half of our workforce who are freelancers have as of yet had no support, that is something that's really worth making a point about, I think.
Thank you. Mehdi Ascaria has had his hand up very patiently. Can we go there, please?
Thank you, John. Just at the back of what Errol said earlier, I'm sure he alluded to that. What I'm rather concerned is that much of what government has done, and I think one has got to acknowledge there have been eye-watering numbers. Now, whether they are world-leading or not, but the numbers are quite staggering. But what I'm concerned about is that they are not targeted. Taking the arts and museum allocation, for instance, they seem to be one size fits all. They are not targeted, for instance, in the case of arts with respect to the local organization. They are in danger of dying away, withering and dying away and disappearing. It appears to me that the money allocated is for the overall, for the national organization, perhaps British Museum, National Theatre, National Gallery, etc. Those are big enough, those boys, to look after themselves. Those who are not able to look after themselves are local and the regional organizations. And we will see many of them will actually disappear. And we are all going to be affected by that.
Are there any near where you live that have already closed or have put posters up saying help, help?
Yes. My own local museum at Wantage. I live in Wantage, and from what I hear, they are desperate at the moment.
And not getting any money at all. Now,
where's they Wantage? Are doing their best. They're actually, John, they're doing their best. But what it is most of the art exhibitions, art organizations, they are not going to be able to look after themselves.
Well, I think you're very probably right, and we'll all lose a great deal if so. Let's come back to Louise Simpson. Simpson without the P. You were basically assailing the government for its cultural awareness. Do I have that right?
You have it completely right. And, you know, in response to the lady who spoke about Jenny Lee, I'm sure Jenny Lee is wonderful. I'm sorry, I don't know who she is. But I think the problem is in this country, there just is no deep set cultural sense. So it shouldn't be people like Jenny Lee fighting from, you know, waving their arms and screaming out in the wilderness, or that lady talking about comedians. There should be a deep sense of culture here, of which there just isn't. And if you look at European countries, there just is. And I mean, there are too many examples to go into, but, you know, Hannah Rothschild, I think, said in one of your recent think-ins, she even said, well, you know, it's us individuals who keep the arts going. And yes, she may be in the privileged position to be able to do so. But what about state aid? And in fact, this lump of money does reflect an enormous change, cultural change, in that they have actually recognized it, not just for the money that comes into Shepperton Studios, but actually as a deeply important part of the country. And really up till now, you know, historically speaking, through centuries, they just don't have it. It's all rested on the backs of individuals, some of whom you've heard of speaking today.
It's very interesting because the basis of the cultural sector's argument for funding before it came was, look, government, we deliver a huge sum back to the economy every day. In other words, it was a very practical argument. I've seen sums of £111 billion a year. I think the more frequently used numbers are a bit lower than that. Still very, very big, even by comparison, for example, with the Premier League. But what you're arguing for, and correct me if I'm wrong, is a different sort of understanding of the value of the sector, not simply as a contributor to the national bottom line,
Absolutely.
but
yeah,
to national
absolutely.
life.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I just don't feel there is that. You know, I mean, I'm an artist. You know, I think there are so many creative people in the country, and I think there's a lot of freedom within that artistic métier, but there just isn't a cultural sense. And I just don't know why we don't have it, but we don't have it. I don't know how you build it in, but perhaps this large lump of money could be just a window of opportunity where the country can, not the country, the government can see the cultural importance. Because once you see the overall importance for art and culture and comedians and Jenny Lee and Hannah Rothschild and Tessa Jowell and, you know, the sort of things that I make, you get that all just falls into a kind of pool of being part of the culture rather than just fighting against the system throughout people's lives. You know, I mean, I'm not directly involved, but, you know, I know the Arcola Theatre. You know, I mean, of course, the play that was running when the shutdown happened just closed. But when are they going to start acting again? It's a tiny theatre. How can you have people set a metre apart from each other? Theatre, you know, they've got to really help people. And I mean, why not, I don't know, produce a universal basic income just for actors out of work now? You know, somehow keep these people afloat so that they can develop. They will have the imagination to find different ways of producing plays. That I don't think is an issue. But just the reason I kind of responded to the lady about Jenny Lee, pre-Jenny Lee comment, is, you know, how do you impress on the country the importance of culture? I only see a country that's interested in business. Right. You know, I you know, that's the whole Brexit thing, is just business. It's not culture, it's not history, it's not free trade, it's just money. This country only understands money. And, you know, they just don't get culture. And all the things you've said and all the things all the other people says are the value of culture. And just maybe having actually dipped their hands into their pocket with this lump, maybe we are going to see a beginning.
Okay, well, thank you, Louise. I notice in the chat that Alison Stancliffe is referring to other governments, and I'm not clear if you're making the argument, Alison, if we could come to you, that other governments have been different from previous ones. From this one, I'm sorry.
Hi, I just think we have very, very short memories in this country. I don't disagree with Louise. Like, in fact, virtually many, many countries in Europe and certainly in the US, the values, what you'd call the cultural values, are starkly different in different parts of the population. And that means that the arts, as some of us see it, are inconsequential to a large amount of the population. I live on Tyneside. I can tell you that from when we tried to get the City of Culture. It's just that if you look back more than 10 years, back beyond 2010, the Labour government then had a completely different sense of the value of the arts. It's not that long ago. You go back even further, and I mentioned Jenny Lee. She was this absolutely fabulous culture minister that we had through the Labour years. Sorry to go on about Labour, but it does seem to be a political divide, and we're forgetting, you know. So to lump the whole of the nation as kind of cultural no man's land it's not right. I can feel the pain. I mean, I'm in pain because I care so much about this little theatre in Newcastle that is probably not going to make it. But it's political, basically, and the politics have changed in the last 10-15 years. And so,
Alison, can I just interrupt very briefly? You say this.
Sorry, I've gone a bit over the top on that one.
No. If you've got to take a call.
Yeah,
anyway, right. I was going to ask, and I'm interested generally, if small venues don't make it / go under, is that really it? Or is it entirely plausible that they come back somehow, if not stronger, then more determined, next year or whenever there's a vaccine and we get back to normal? It's just a question to leave hanging there. Bayram Mali, you have your hand up. Can we come to you?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
So basically, I see two main issues within this funding and how the funding is structured, or the so-called bailout. So basically, we have the 8 big galleries and museums who has secured funds. And specifically, when you look at Tate and what they have been recently doing with their announcement for redundancy for more than over 300 staff. And this staff is one of the most diverse staff. This staff is working in the cafe, in the retail shops, and they said that they will, even with the aid, with the governmental aid, they will continue with the redundancies. And this is quite problematic because we had these huge galleries coming up with this, we support Black Lives Matter, we are committed for diversity and inclusion within our museums, but obviously when the pandemic hits, we don't have time for diversity and inclusion. We only care about the money, even though we are receiving a lot of aid. That doesn't matter. And when you look at the current funds of Tate, you can see that they have in their pocket 20 million of reserves. So this,
sorry, that was the Tate, was it?
Yes, Tate.
Yeah.
So basically, they're lying. So it's quite problematic in a way. And the second part is the other part of the fund, which is secured for all other applying bodies, is quite, in a way, it's a structure that is competitive, and either you get it or you don't get it, and you are fighting with everybody else, which is quite not healthy for the cultural sector in the UK in general.
Are you in the position of competing for any of this money?
I mean, the details are so little that I think nobody actually knows what the eligibility criteria would be.
Right. But would you say that you're in the sector? Do you work?
I'm in the sector, but I am a trainee.
Okay.
And as an activist from BP or not BP, I find it quite problematic in a way how this money is, again, will be given out, because it will lead to further privatization of the art sector. And I do really believe that in the end of the day, we really need a culture new deal, because if you look at the sector of culture, it has more, it gives more money to the UK than oil, than cars and planes combined.
Okay, let me just stop you there, because you're saying this is public money that we're talking about. So how does that lead to further privatization of the sector?
It will lead to more private companies supporting people, supporting organizations who are not able to get the bailout money, because the whole structure of the bailout money is so competitive and everybody's fighting against each other. So a lot of people will turn into private entities, because this will be the only way forward for them.
And in that event, is private support a bad thing or a good thing?
No, it's not a bad thing. I'm not arguing we need to end private support at all, but if we really want to have a culture new deal, as I said, I really think that the support must be much bigger.
Okay, thank you very much. Yelena, I see that you have your hand up and I want to come to you in a second, but first I wanted to come back to Annabelle, because you also said in your seminal email that you said you thought it was probably likely that a good deal, if not most of this money, would end up going to London-based institutions. Why do you think that? Just referring to what Bayram was saying about the 8 big institutions that seem to have a lock on quite a lot of it.
I think the fear when we had the announcement was talk of the crown jewels, which are generally seen to be the big organisations that exist in London, perhaps with the exception of the RSC that sits in Stratford. But, you know, that seems to be the only kind of crown jewel outside London, or considered to be. So I think that, coupled with the track record of arts funding and the proportion of arts funding that has gone to London, to the kind of detriment of the rest of the country, it just rings alarm bells. It was interesting when the Chancellor spoke yesterday in an interview. He did talk about the arts funding being used up and down the country. Maybe that's hopefully that's fed through to DCMS and this is shared out. I think it's really important. The Arts Council have started to look at rebalancing and started to consider the balance between investing in organisations in London and outside. we don't want to see all the money pulled out of London, but we do need to invest across the country. And I think that would help with our messaging, just picking up on that point about, you know, the government not sort of seeing the value of arts and culture. Well, maybe we're not making the right arguments. And if we keep putting white middle class actors up to make our arguments, and, you know, to campaign for money for, frankly, white middle class people to go in to sit in theatres and watch shows, then we are not doing our sector credit. There are people across the country from, you know, all backgrounds who are enjoying arts and culture in their local areas, and we need to be making those arguments. And maybe then we might gain a little bit more traction.
You have huge experience in sort of grassroots arts organisations all over the north and the northeast. Does the mechanism exist to distribute money equitably to small venues and grassroots organisation without it becoming the sort of competitive free-for-all that Bayram was talking about?
I think it's public money, so it's always competitive to a certain extent,
Right.
because you have to show public benefit, and I think that's right. I think that the issue is that you know, decisions aren't always taken locally, so there isn't necessarily the understanding. And you know, the classic, what we've just heard today, that DCMS are going to be setting the eligibility criteria. I wonder, you know, when was the last time that a DCMS officer or minister set foot in Teesside, where I'm based? How much do they really know about what is going on in all areas of the country? And frankly, how could they? You know, I'm sure they're not a massive team. So how are they tapping into the local knowledge? You know, we've seen the Arts Council shrink over the last few years. We still have a regional office, but again, it's much smaller. So where are they picking up on that local knowledge? How do they know what's going on in that comedy club, and how much public benefit there is of investing in that organisation? It's easy to see the public benefit of investing in the British Museum. It's less easy to see the public benefit from London, if that's where your office is, of the investing in a comedy club or an arts centre in a small town.
Right. By the way, do you know the answer to your own question, when a DCMS person last set foot in Teesside?
I don't actually.
But might have
happened. Try and find out.
Yeah. Yellen, I'm still going to come to you, but I see Daniel Dipper making the point in the chat that the number was higher than what industry bodies asked for, that they listened and were heard. Daniel, if we can come to you, do you think that the government is being unfairly criticised at this point?
Hello. Yeah, just had to turn my microphone on. So in terms of the bailout, yeah, I think that actually some of the criticism the government are receiving, I think, is slightly unfair, because as I say there, they did get a lot more money, frankly, than I was expecting. So I'm quite positive about that. And actually, a lot of industry bodies, from what I've heard, were consulted in that decision, and I think are still being consulted where the money is going. So actually, I mean, I heard something about how it was something like £100 million a month would actually be enough to kind of keep these settings in hibernation so that they could open when it's safe to do so. And they've got more money than that. So yeah, there is something in the detail, because it depends how much of this is loans and, you know, what the criteria on the loans are, and actually if that's feasible for these companies, particularly as we don't actually know when it's safe to reopen, and that's not something anybody can predict. But yeah, I do think there is a little bit unfair criticism kind of on that. And I was thinking about sort of this idea of these local bodies that need support. So hopefully these larger arts organisations are responding to some of that and feeding that into the government. But actually, I saw in the chat as well about Scottish and Welsh devolution, and actually how some of these, maybe they've been slightly better at responding to the needs of their local areas. So I know it's kind of quite a touchy subject, I suppose would be a way to describe it, but actually, is this a case where actually maybe we need English devolution of some form, or more of it, instead of just the current kind of mayor system? Would that actually be more responsive, not just for the arts, but actually for a lot of other issues as well? Because I know there's fears of English nationalism, but at the same time, a lot of people do want decisions to be made closer to home as such. So is that a way of resolving that?
Thanks, Daniel. Thank you. That is English devolution, subject for a series of future thinkings, I suppose. Yelena, thank you for your patience. What's on your mind?
Not at all. I want to return to something that Louise Simpson pointed out earlier, because I think one issue is that we kind of have constructed this very false dichotomy between cultural and financial value. And I think the solution to that is affording the arts the political and financial recognition that it deserves, and recognise actually the financial value that it provides to the nation. And I think, like I said, one way you could do that is to consider the arts, as we have done with respect to the long-term impact of austerity on our capacity to react to the coronavirus. So we talk about how schools and healthcare services were starved even before the virus hit us effectively, and that limited their capacity in order to manage it. And I think if we approach culture from the same perspective, then that will help us to understand how we can reform it within this idea of a cultural New Deal, which I haven't heard of before, but I think is really interesting. So, for instance, if you compare the UK to Berlin, I think I heard one statistic that said that the UK's cultural funding is roughly the same as the Berlin state government's funding for the Philharmonic and for the various institutions that exist solely in that one city, which really illustrates, when you think about it, how underfunded the arts are here. And I think that's something that's only going to get worse with Brexit, and we've seen the potential introduction of charges for artists to take their instruments abroad. But how can that make any sense when you consider the fact that the arts contributes the same amount to the UK economy as the financial industry does, as the construction industry does? It's so important. So looking at it through this kind of austerity style lens, I think helps when we consider that the bailout, this emergency funding, is just too little too late, and there really is need for long-term systemic and structural change of how we perceive the arts and how we value the arts. And perhaps, unfortunately, maybe we need to adopt a more financial notion of value in order to foster that cultural value that we think the arts doesn't have in the UK.
Okay, you've made me want to be a devil's advocate a little bit. All right, now I beg everyone's indulgence. I don't mean to be offensive, but doesn't good art require a bit of hunger? And I say this as someone who covered Hollywood from Hollywood for 6 years in another life. And there was obviously no suggestion at any point that any of the big studios, or indeed the small production companies, get any public money from Uncle Sam. And it was very striking to me that in addition to all the tentpole marquee releases that we like to deride as tosh over here, Hollywood generated surpluses big enough to fund experimental and in many cases brilliant movie making as well. And I remember a particular point of comparison was when, with a huge amount of French public money and a tremendous fanfare, the film Indochine came out and bombed. And I just would be very interested to know whether or not people see some force in the argument that the creative sector is in a category of its own precisely because it's creative. And I'm only saying that to be provocative, but by all means bite my head off. Naomi, you've had your hand up for a while, so let's come to you. And by the way, I did want to come back to Breed just in relation to what I've just been saying and the sort of scrappiness of comedy. But Naomi first, what's on your mind?
I was just responding to the point that you made about hunger, and I think it's actually a really problematic road to go down. I work in Bristol in the cultural sector, and this year we're doing a project all around Thomas Chatterton, the famous poet, whose death was sort of glorified as this sort of young suicide, and his legacy brought around this whole idea that artists have to suffer. You have to live in poverty in a hovel, and if you're not doing that, then you're not. That's what creates great art. And I think that's really problematic for artists' mental health, for our understanding of the impact that art has on the world. And it's why artists and those working in the cultural sector are so often told, we're going to pay you absolute peanuts, but it shouldn't matter because you should love what you do. So therefore you should be in at 7 o'clock in the morning and you should leave at 10 o'clock at night, and we're not going to pay you very well. And we know we're underfunded, but you know, we all love what we do. And I think we have to take ourselves seriously in order for other people to take us seriously. And I think one of the things we should think about is stop to change the language away from funding the arts to talk about investing in the arts. It was all of the sort of the language of Sam Mendes' piece in the Financial Times. If you invest in us, we will always under-promise and over-deliver. The impact that we make in other sectors, in our workforces, in hospitality, in leisure, in transport, is just colossal, let alone mental health and well-being and connecting societies and finding empathy. And actually, you know, it often gets talked about as, you know, arts are over here and business is over here. We are also a business, you know, we generate huge financial returns. I think the conversations earlier are absolutely right. We end up doing this tricky balance where we're not allowed to talk about ourselves as the kind of the fluffy sector, you know, talking about the positivity that we bring and the difference that we bring, because if we talk too much like that, we get dismissed as being the fluffy, the nice to haves, the garnishes on the plate. You're not as important as healthcare and, you know, and housing and other bits. But if we talk about ourselves too financially, then again what we actually create gets lost and we get forced too much down a financial path. So we're in this funny place, and we do have to find a way of telling our story better and of expressing our value better. But hunger shouldn't be part of it.
Very well said. Thank you very much. Talking about being in a funny place, Breed, can I come back to you? Because as a manager of comedians, you find yourself, if I understand it right, in the position of trying to make the case to government, whether by Twitter or direct means, to sort of prove a point that we all know in a way is true, that grassroots comedy feeds the entire edifice of the creative industries. But is it very hard to sort of pinpoint the proof of that? Or do you actually have stories that prove it all the time?
Well, I mean, I think being asked that question is sort of part of the same problem. Like no grassroots theatre venue is being asked to prove why it needs to stay in existence. And to be asked the question, and I've been asked this a couple of times within some press interviews over the last few days, of like, well, why do you need to be included in this? And again, it comes back to the same point that was just made very eloquently by Naomi about hunger. We shouldn't have to be seen to be more passionate or sort of more in need. We're not saying that we're more anything. We're just saying that we are also a cultural industry. We're an art form, so we need to be included within the same breath. I think one big thing that's come up over the last couple of months is we've been lauded in a lot of ways for having had taken the art form, put it online, and be kind of doing our best to sort of hustle back to be able to offer comedy shows to people all around the UK. And this mental health question and well-being question that comes up a lot with regards to our industry specifically is really where we come into our own with regards to like what our purpose is, I think. And yeah, the statistics that we have from our survey show us that none of those have been monetized. Less than 5% of comics that have put their work online have earned more than 20% of the income they expected to earn before this happened. So doesn't that prove in its entirety that the demand is there for the art form to continue, but we aren't receiving the subsidy to be able to do that? I think that's kind of, I think it's a difficult point to make, I suppose.
Well, I mean, I sympathise. I can't imagine what it's like being up against the bean counters from DCMS when they decide on the eligibility criteria and how they're going to divvy this up. Errol, can I come back to you before we run out of time? Do you have any sense of what in practical terms your institution is going to have to do to access some of this funding?
Well, no, actually, because until I know more about, you know, as people have said, the eligibility criteria, we don't really know what the tactics would be. And I mean, what we've been doing, we've been doing you know, working all hours of the day, really, especially since this pandemic hit, approaching trusts and foundations. That's been our main target. And I think in a way, the trusts and foundations have been more responsive, because there are various schemes that are targeted at smaller organizations or people doing a particular type of work, or you know, for example, there's one that we just heard about last week, which was about the cost of reopening, you know, how much, and we've been able to, we're putting into that application things like the PPE, you know, safety of our staff and our people who visit us. So they've been much more targeted and nuanced and more local as well, you know, and one hasn't actually heard these, you know, this hubris about world leading and crown jewels, you know, that they've tended to be very, very specific. I mean, even the Arts Council themselves have had emergency funding, Heritage Lottery Fund, you know, the quasi-government ones, but also you've had the London Strategic, I'm talking about London because I'm based in London, but, you know, there's been the London Community Response Fund. You've also had private funders getting together with some of the public ones to put up schemes. So I think that the DCMS, the thing that strikes me about the DCMS announcement is very heavy, apart from the issues that people have talked about with the criteria of what's called the arts. It's very clumsy, actually, it's not very nuanced in the way that it's targeted. It's using these big, clumsy terms, and what we need is something more nuanced. And I actually think that, in a way, the Treasury's job retention scheme was much more broad-based, has benefited many more arts organisations, actually, than what we're hearing about, because anybody could apply for that, you know, to support jobs. And I think a big issue going forward is jobs. And I think there's a strategic choice to be had between supporting jobs, retaining jobs, and money spent on infrastructure and costs like that, organisational core costs.
There is still time, isn't there, for a little bit of nuance to appear, some small print to appear from DCMS and the Arts Council? Or do you think that the sort of broad outlines are already set in stone and that's the problem?
I think that DCMS has this tradition. I think I'm more hopeful of the arts organisation, the Arts Council, because it funds a much more diverse portfolio of organisations than DCMS. I think that's why DCMS has got into this crown jewels thing, because they don't fund small, you know, small independent museums or galleries and so on. The Arts Council, though, does, and I'm more hopeful of a more nuanced response from the Arts Council. But I'm afraid the DCMS has always had this, you know, this more remote idea of what is culturally important, and even what was talked about earlier, this idea of cultural value, as again, you know, valuing culture for its own sake, as against this kind of neoliberal idea of evaluating culture in terms of its financial value. I think DCMS is much more into that, and that, you know, it comes out in the whole lumping together of sport and media and art and so on. And I'm more hopeful that the Arts Council can also target some smaller, more diverse-led. There's an issue about diversity in this as well, in terms of diverse-led organisations tend to be the smaller ones going to be hit. I mean, the theatre was mentioned earlier. You know, we've got to have a very nuanced, local, grassroots response to this.
Thank you, Errol. I wanted to ask all three of you, actually, before we run out of time, very briefly, you can answer in a word or a sentence as you wish. and I'll start with you, Errol, if I may. Are you more or less optimistic for the institution that you're responsible for than you were a month ago?
No, I'm not. I'm sorry.
So you're actually less optimistic?
Oh no, I'm not any more optimistic.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just
you're in a wait and see.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Breed.
I would say I'm probably more optimistic for the organizations and brick and mortar venues, but less optimistic for the freelance workforce.
Right. So no sign since the announcement of response from government to what has been a pretty unanimous plea.
With regards to freelancers,
yeah.
No, not as of yet that I have been told.
Okay, thank you. Annabelle, more or less optimistic than a month ago?
I'd agree with Reid. I'm more optimistic for bricks and mortar organisations. I'm mildly more optimistic for the organisation that I run because we are a building. I'm worried about artists and freelancers, but we will fight to the end. The money has not been given out yet, so whilst there is a short window in which to try and influence those decisions, that is what we should be trying to do.
Right, thank you. And thanks everybody for pitching in. I'm sorry for the infelicitous phrasing of my question using the word hunger. I appreciate that it's freighted. It's but I think occasionally a little grit in the argument may help elicit some strongly held views. And Naomi, thank you for coming back and speaking up, as you said so eloquently, was important for artists to take themselves seriously and walk this line between making the economic case for the cultural industries without allowing people to forget the culture itself. I mean, very briefly, let me just pull a few thoughts together. We started what's world leading about the arts bailout, and I think people agreed that compared with the headline numbers from other European countries, but not the US, there's nothing world leading about it. And I think the appeals from Breed, from Alison and Errol and others on behalf of freelancers of all types makes it very clear that if this had been presented, not just as a big number, but as one that had been thought through, as one that appreciated the texture, the complexion of the cultural sector, the industry, if you want to call it that, in all its grassroots magnificence, and had thought through some mechanisms for getting small amounts of this money to smaller places and individuals, then I guess it would not just have been world leading, but it would have been unique. And it's clearly not that, but as Annabelle just said, it's worth keeping on fighting to the end. I thought Breed made a really interesting point about live comedy as not just a source of laughs, but of access to the arts more generally. And my big green felt pen also alerts me to what Louise said about, in her view, absence of a deep sense of culture in this country. Alison picked up on that and begged to differ on behalf of previous Labour governments. I think it's a really interesting question, and probably for another day, where culture sits in the national lives generally. And I think the fact that we speak English must be one reason why there are so many commercial opportunities that are simply not available elsewhere in Europe, and which perhaps colour government attitudes to cultural funding elsewhere in Europe as well. But I'll finish just reminding everybody of Errol's alarm bells ringing in his head about money going to crown jewels and crown jewels only. We know that it's not going to be as blunt an instrument as that, but let us all take every opportunity that we have to remind government that that would be a disappointment if the only institutions that benefited from all this were those that are frankly going to survive anyway. Thanks all for joining us, and do so again next week. Have a great weekend. The sun's come out in South London. and we can't clap, but I would like to thank Annabelle, Breed and Errol very much, and everyone else for joining in, and Barney for managing the chat. I'll go back over it and see what was said. Thank you very much and goodbye.